To sew a perfect hem, you need to know what type of hem to sew for what you're making. I'm Ali and I've been making clothes since the 90s, so I'm used to working with all sorts of fabrics. So whether you're using a basic cotton like on this shirt dress, a really fine silk chiffon like on this wedding dress, or at the other extreme, a really heavy fabric like this heavy boiled wool on this lined coat, I'm going to show you in detail how to sew 10 hems. The most essential hems I think that you should learn when you're dressmaking. The 10 hems I'm going to show you in this tutorial are a single folded hem, a double folded hem, a blind hem sewn on a machine and a blind hem sewn by hand, and then also a bagged out blind hem like on the coat I've just shown you. Then I'll show you the regular rolled hem on the wedding dress sample I just showed you, and also a serged hem which is perfect for underneath layers. Then I'll show you how to sew a perfect curve using a facing, and lastly I'll show you how to sew with jersey, both using a cover stitch machine which is great for a professional finish, and also a twin needle that you can sew on any sewing machine. For each of the hems, I'll show you first on a garment how the hem looks, and then I'll show you on a little sample how to sew them up so you know everything you need to know to get a perfect result. I want everyone to be able to sew a perfect hem, so even if you don't have an overlock or a cover stitch machine like I show you in some of the demonstrations, on each of these hems I'm going to show you an alternative that you can do on any sewing machine. I'd suggest watching the video through to see all the different techniques, and then when you do any project and you are deciding on what type of hem to do, you are going to know based on whether your fabric is knit or woven, whether it's lightweight or heavy, and the style of the garment, how full it is, any of those things. You're going to know what kind of hem is best for what you're making. I'm going to show you the first two hems at the same time. There's the single fold and the double fold. So the single fold is great when you are doing something quite lightweight and it's got a curved hem, say on a circle skirt or a double circle like this dress. It's perfect because it allows you to sew that curve. If you've got an overlocker, it gives it a really neat finish, or you can use pinking shears, or you can overlock on a basic machine using an overlock stitch. The other hem I'm going to show you at the same time is the double fold, which I used on this shirt dress, and this means that there's no edges showing, everything is encased in the double fold. This is great for a slightly deeper hem. You can do it as narrow or as deep as you want to. So that's the single and double fold I'm going to show you now. For the single fold, I've overlocked the edge. If you don't have an overlocker and you want a nice finish on it, you could put some kind of binding on it, or you could just cut it with pinking shears, or you could just leave it raw edge if you've got a fabric that doesn't fray too much. Although if you do have a fabric that frays and you don't have an overlocker, I'd recommend a double fold, which is what I'll show you on this one. So starting with the single fold, it is the most straightforward hem you can do, and it literally is a single fold. So I'm just going to pin this exactly the same width all the way along, and then I can get this stitched. So if you want to do any kind of decorative stitch, then I would recommend sewing it on this side, in which case you'll have to work out how far from the edge to sew it. Otherwise, the easiest way is just to sew it on this side, and you want to be catching the hem just a few millimeters in from the top. Then on the double fold, again, it's pretty straightforward. It's exactly what we're saying. It's a double fold. So you want to be folding it once and then folding it again. So you can either do a really small hem like this, or you can do a much bigger hem if you want something a bit more sturdy. If you're doing a hem with a slight curve on it, then I'd recommend keeping it very small, because the bigger this gets, the deeper it is. When it's got a curve, the harder it's going to be to get it to sit flat. I will show you in a minute how to hem a similar kind of fabric that's on a curve using a facing. But for now, let's just concentrate on this double fold hem. So I've folded that over twice and pinned it, and then all the raw edge is all concealed in the hem. So let's get these sewn up. So as I said before, I'm going to use a contrast thread for each of these so you can really see what I'm doing. And I'm going to try and get the camera as close as I can, and I will try my hardest not to get my hands in the way. So for a single fold, you just want a regular sewing machine foot, and I use a stitch length of 2.6 generally. It's quite a standard kind of size. If you've got a much bigger weave, you might want to go slightly longer. If you've got a really fine fabric, you might want to go slightly shorter. And I normally just start with a couple of reverse stitches so it doesn't come undone, and you just want to keep this lined up. So I'm just lining it up with the middle of the foot, and it's really that simple. So I'm just sewing down the middle of the overlock. And then the machine setup is exactly the same for the double fold, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to sew nice and close to where the edge of that is. I want to make sure I don't accidentally go over the edge here because it won't catch it, and I'm just going to sew that exactly the same. And that's the hems done. So they basically look the same from the outside, and on the inside, on the single fold, you've just got the overlocking and the stitching going through here. Obviously you'd normally use the same colour, and then for the double fold you can see it's all nicely encased, so it's really neat. So on a fabric like this is quite a good depth. This is about 2 centimetres, and if you've got a bit of a curve, then I would recommend doing this much smaller. So a lot of it with these, deciding on what to do, is down to how heavy the fabric is, if you've got an overlocker, if it's on a curve or if it's straight. You've got all those things to think about. But for a regular cotton poplin like this, when it's cut straight, this is a nice basic hem. I'm going to show you 3 different ways of sewing a blind hem. The first one I'm going to show you is using the blind hem stitch on a regular sewing machine. So you can only see a tiny little bit of the stitch on the outside, and it's nice and neat on the inside. If you've got an overlocker, it's great to overlock this first, or you can use a bias binding or use pinking shears to finish off the inside if you don't have one. For the blind hem, I like to overlock it first because it just means it's nice and neat on the inside. You don't want this fraying. If it does fray, then your hem's going to come undone and it'll just look messy as well. So I've overlocked this first. It's hard to see what's inside and out for this. So this is my main side, and this is going to come up here like this. So I'm pretty sure all sewing machines come with a blind hem foot, and they will tell you in the instructions how to fold this and how to use the foot. But I've got to say, the first time I used one, I was a little bit confused. First thing I'm going to do is just fold this to where my hem's going to be. And I generally use 3 to 4 centimetres for my hem when I'm doing this kind of hem. So I'm just going to pin that in place. And then I'm just going to give this a little press to hold that hem in place once the pins come out. I've just pressed this from this side with the pins in, but just be careful if you're using a fabric where the heads of these pins might melt or it might leave a little mark, then don't do what I've just done. So that's folded. So when these come out, it's going to already have that nice finish. And then what you want to do is you need to flip this over like this, so you've got a little bit of overhang from underneath. So if I show you from the side, it makes that shape. So I'm going to fold it back, and then I'm going to fold this. So I use the width of my overlocking as my guide, and then I'm going to pin it like this. So the fold here meets the edge of that. So if I pin over here, and then I'll show you again from the side how it looks. So it's this shape. So that is the bottom of my finished garment. I've then folded it back, and this fold meets that. Now, apologies if it doesn't make sense, but hopefully if you rewind it and just watch that again, it'll be nice and clear. And it's one of those things that looks a bit confusing, but when you actually do it, it's really easy and it makes a lot of sense. And then in future, you'll think, what on earth are you ever confused about? So I need to now go and get this sewn up. So you need the blind hem stitch for doing this. So I'll show you on my Janome machine. I'm sure other machines are going to be pretty much the same. So hopefully I've remembered the correct number, and that's right. And it tells me on mine to use foot G. So if you have a Janome, chances are yours is going to be a G as well. And this is what the foot looks like. It's got this little bit under here which lines up with where I've folded it. So that's how that foot looks. If you've got a different brand machine, I'm sure it's going to be pretty similar. And this has automatically set my stitch. So if I zoom in, hopefully you can see what it looks like. Let's try and zoom right in. So this is the shape of the stitch. So if you've not got a computerized machine, then I'm sure if you have a dial or buttons, your stitch is going to look pretty much the same as this. It does a few stitches on the right, and then it does one to the left, and then it keeps going like that. So this has automatically set the width and the stitch length for me, along with that pattern, which I can only assume is what all machines do. So let's have a look at how to sew it. So I've put my blind hem foot on, and then I've taken the first lot of pins out that I put in. I know that's the edge, and that's why I ironed it, so it's now keeping that nice edge. And all I need to do now is line up this fold here with the little bit that I showed you before that sticks down at the bottom there. And if your foot isn't exactly the same, then the principle, I'm sure, of this stitch will be the same. So I'm going to try my hardest not to knock the camera now. It's always quite hard when I'm trying to sew like this, not to get my hands in the way, not to knock my tripod and all of that. So I will try my best. Right, so I'm sewing down here now, and I'm making sure that this lines up with this. You don't want this to move either way. If you move your fabric to this side, it's not going to pick up on here, and then it won't sew the hem. And if you come over this side, then you're going to see the stitches too much. So you just need to make sure it all lines up. So it's done 1 to the left, and then 1, 2, 3 to the right. I think it just does 3, no, 4, 5. 1 to the left. So 5 on the right, 1 on the left. Shows how much I pay attention when I'm doing this much faster. And I'm just going to sew the whole length of this, and then I'll show you how it looks. I've used this bright green thread so we can see really clearly how it's sewn it. And this is how it looks from the right side. So you can see it's only got these tiny little stitches, and it looks a lot better than a stitch line going across. And when that's not in a contrast colour, if I'd have used the right colour, if I'd have used either the red or the pink that's in this, you wouldn't hardly see those. If it's a much flatter, less dense fabric, then you would see them a bit more. But on a dense fabric like this, they really don't show up that much. So from this side, I don't know how well you can see it, you've got the zigzag in the green that's going over that overlocking. And you can see now this is the position it was in. So it's caught that bit there, and then it's stitched into this bit. And that's the little bit that you see from that side. So I just need to give that a little bit of a press, but I think you'll agree that looks lovely and neat, and it's really, really quick to do. Much quicker than hand sewing if you've got a fabric that will allow you to do it. While the machine sewn blind hem is great, a hand sewn one looks even neater. You can buy a blind hemmer sewing machine, but unless you're doing a lot of blind hems, then it's probably not worth the investment. To sew this by hand is actually really easy, and the more you do it, the quicker you get. So doing this by hand, you get absolutely nothing. Hopefully I'm holding that properly. You get absolutely nothing on the outside. You can't see any stitches. So I'll show you now how to hand sew a blind hem. The reason I prefer a hand sewn hem for something like velvet is because if you're doing the blind hem like I've just done and it's picking up that bit there, you see that little stitch go through there, it could then pucker the pile. It just isn't going to look as nice. So this is why I really like to do hand sewn hem for this kind of fabric. As slow as it is, it just looks so much nicer, and it's worth taking your time. If you're going to go to the effort to make something really nice out of a more formal kind of fabric like velvet or a satin or something like that, where you really don't want to see any stitching at all, then it's worth hand sewing it. So I'm going to sew it with this velvet. It's exactly the same principle on any other fabric, and this is a great one to do with satins. You can pick up the tiniest little thread from your fabric to stitch this down. So I'm going to pick a contrast thread that really shows up and show you how to hand sew this. So I'm sure there's more than one way of hand sewing a hem, but this is the way that I do it. So I've just got a single thread because I don't want this to be bulky by doubling it up. And all I'm going to do, and hopefully you can see this clear enough, is I'm just going to use my needle to pick up the tiniest little thread from the fabric. I'm always struggling to do things when I'm demonstrating them. So you can see there, you can't hardly see it on the needle, but if I move the needle, you can see it's caught it. So I just do a stitch on the main fabric and then try not to drop it like I just did. And then you can just do a normal stitch, making sure you only do it in that folded up bit of fabric. You don't want it going all the way through to the other side. And you can do a couple of stitches on that side if you want, or you can just do one. And then you need to go back onto this side. And again, this is why it takes so long, because you struggle sometimes to pick it up. So you pick up the tiniest little stitch. It's not so bad with something like velvet, but when you're using a satin, you've got to be really careful. And then do the same on there, and you just need to work your way across. So when I'm doing it, I tend to do a few stitches where I just do one on my hem piece, and then once I've done, say, 3 repetitions of this, then I'll do a double stitch on this side just to make sure it's all holding into place. So I'm going to do that all the way across before I show you how it looks. And make sure when you're pressing this, if you are using a really beautiful fabric where you don't want to see the hem, don't then press your hem all the way through this and leave a big ridge where that edge is, because you're going to ruin all that really nice, neat hand sewing that you've done. So you can see there, you can't see any of that from this side. So I'm just going to get that finished off and pressed so you can see how it looks finished. And that's how it looks. You don't see anything on the outside at all, not even the tiniest little stitch. I've sewn that with yellow so you would see that had it come through. And you can see it's held up enough, even just by catching those tiny little threads, it holds it enough to do that. If you want a slightly more glamorous finish than this, you could always put a little bit of tape on it or something rather than just overlocking. But that's a great way of finishing any kind of evening wear fabrics, velvet, satins, anything like that. A bagged out hem is perfect for coats and jackets. You can also use it on skirts and dresses where you want the lining and the outer layer joined together. It's really easy to sew, so I'll show you now how to sew this kind of hem. I've put pins on this so that I can iron this before I sew it. So on my main fabric, these pins are 3 centimetres from the edge, and on the lining they are 2 centimetres from the edge. So I'm gonna just press these before I get any sewing done. So my outside one has been folded and pressed to exactly where the bottom edge is. And then this isn't the bottom edge on my lining. This is going to sit up from the bottom edge. So if you've ever looked at the bottom of a coat or a sleeve on a coat, something like that, then this is exactly how it works. So those are folded to where they need to be. And then you need to decide when you're making your pattern what the difference is between your lining and your outer. But about 1 centimetre to 1.5 centimetres is a good distance. So if I now pull that like this, you can see that these line up. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just sew these together. Now I won't bother you with showing you on the machine what I'm doing, because I am literally going to sew them right sides together down the length of the hem, just a regular stitch, and then I'll show you how to finish this off. So you can see now that's going to attach that there. So I'll just get this sewn up, and I'm just going to sew it 1 centimetre from my edge. That's now sewn up, and you don't need to worry about overlocking or doing anything on this. If you've got a fabric that frays a lot, you might want to overlock it just so you don't have lots of loose threads on the inside. But otherwise you don't need to, because you're not going to see it. So that's how the inside looks when it's finished, and obviously there's no stitching visible on the outside. But if you wear it like this, there's nothing holding this hem up. So the final bit you need to do is just some hand stitching to hold it in place. So I need to make sure this is in exactly the right position. I'm pulling this way, but I'm not pulling it open. I'm just letting it lay nice and flat. And I'm just going to put these pins in here. And then this is what needs to be stitched up. If you've got a garment where you've got lots of panels, you could just fix it in those spots. But if you've got a biggish piece like this, then it's a good idea to hand sew it. So that is going to stop this from moving. It's going to stop it from pulling either way. And you can see there where you've got this difference, that's what gives you that little bit of movement. You don't want to sew this, if I just put a couple of pins in it, you don't want to be tempted to sew it where this crease line is and have it joined at that point there, because you can see you've got no movement at all. You want your fabrics to behave independently, and by having it like that, it just gives you a bit of movement, but you don't risk this lining poking out from under here. So if I just take those two out, all I need to do is just exactly the same as the hand sewn hem, just sew this to this main fabric all the way along, and it's just going to stop that moving. So as you can see, I'm just sewing this exactly the same as I did with the hand sewn blind hem. You just want to put your needle through the tiniest little bit on your main fabric, and you can put it through more on this side, and make sure that that thread doesn't go through to the outside, and that's just going to hold all of this in place to stop it moving. You'll find the more you do these kind of hand sewn hems, the quicker you get. You can do your little stitch on the main fabric and on that before you then pull it through. Don't be tempted to double up the thread unless your fabric is very, very thick, because you want this to be as fine as you can get away with. But you can see once you get the hang of it that you can do that quite quick. So that is now finished. So if I take it back to this side, you've got your movement there. That's not going to pull down there. Your lining's not going to come out of the bottom. You just need to work out exactly what seam allowances you need when you're making your pattern. So you need to work out how much the main fabric's going to be folded up, how much the lining's going to be folded up, how much you're going to stitch here, and then how much of this overlap you want here. A rolled hem is perfect for really drapey fabrics like this gorgeous silk chiffon. You can use it on any kind of drapey fabric. The lighter the better, and it is perfect for sheer fabrics like chiffons. It gives a really nice, neat little finish. It can also be called a pin hem, you might know it by that name, and it's actually really easy to sew. You would think it might be tricky, but it's not. I'm going to show you now in 2 steps how to do the perfect rolled hem. You can buy rolled hem feet, but I have never got on with them, and to be honest, I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone who's got on with those little fiddly rolled hem feet. The fabric never goes in properly, it pops out, it's hard to go over seams. So this is the best way to achieve a really neat rolled hem. I've started pinning this, and what I'm doing, I've got a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, and I'm turning it up just 1 centimetre of that 1.5 centimetres. So this is my wrong side that you can see. So if I turn it over, that's the right side, and I've only pinned up 1 centimetre of the 1.5 centimetres. So this is currently 0.5 centimetre too long, and you'll see why I'm doing this in a second. So let's get sewing this and all will be explained. I've got nice and close for this, but it does, however, mean that I'm struggling to actually get to the sewing machine to sew it. So hopefully I can still sew this straight. So I've got a regular foot on, regular stitch size. Everything is regular other than I'm using the contrast thread so that you can see it. And what I want to do is just sew really close to the edge here. I'm going really slow because I'm not very close to the machine and I can't see very well what I'm doing. But I just want to sew as close to the edge as possible and just work my way all the way around this hem. This is why it's a good idea to pin it first, so you make sure you're consistent in how much you're turning this up. So I'm just going to turn the camera off so I can get a bit closer to see what I'm doing, and then I'll show you what we do next to finish this off. So this is how it looks from the outside. Obviously, if that was the right colour, this would look perfect, but it's not in the right colour, just so you can see what I'm doing. So I've got this excess on the inside, which I obviously don't want, and I need to finish it properly. So all I'm going to do, and I'm showing you with the nastiest, slipperiest, shiniest fabric, just so that you can see, even with a really horrible to use fabric like this, it's possible to do a nice hem. So I'm just trimming this as close as I can to where I've sewn it. So I'm just going to go all the way around and trim all of this excess off. Now that that's done, I'm just basically getting this and turning it over again, and I'm just stitching back over that same stitch line. Don't worry if you think it's going to be too heavy having it stitched twice. It really isn't, but it's the best way to get this perfectly neat and exactly the right length. And you can do this on chiffons, any kind of drapey satins and crepes like this. It works for any really drapey fabric. It's great for shears. So I'm very uncomfortable sewing like this, leaning over a tripod, so I will show you once I've finished this off and given it a really good press. And you can see now that's finished, how it sits perfectly, even on that curve, and the inside looks really neat. So even in the contrast colour, you can see that that's a really neat hem. So you can imagine you're using the right colour, you're not even going to notice it. This is the perfect hem for any kind of drapey fabric like this. You want it to be as minimal as possible. Getting this neat might not be easy the first time if you're not used to sewing quite so close to the edge, but you'll soon get the hang of it. And if you go off a little bit and it's a bit wonky, just unpick it and start that bit again. But it's a really great hemming technique to learn. It works on so many fabrics. Another great way of sewing these kind of drapey fabrics is using a serger or an overlocker for this serged roll hem. I wouldn't necessarily use this kind of hem on the outside layer of a dress, but it's perfect for lining layers. It's quick and easy to do if you've got the right machine. So I'll show you now how to set your machine up to sew this really simple serged roll hem. I'm going to show you the overlocked or serged hem on this lovely silk crepeback satin. The stitches really sink into it, and it's a great finish if you don't want it to be bulky or if you're layering something up. So sometimes you might use a fabric like this with some chiffon over the top and you don't want bulky hems. This is a really quick and easy way to do it, and it's a really, really nice finish. So I've cut this to the exact length that I want my hem to be, and I'll show you now. I'm going to use the same colour thread just so you can see really how nice this looks on my overlocker, how to do it. So you'll notice my overlocker is a little bit old and tatty, but it shows how good these machines are. I've had this about 25 years, I think, and it is still going strong. So I'm using this with 3 threads. I'm assuming other make overlockers work exactly the same. They're going to be slightly different how you thread them up, but the principle is going to be the same. So I've only got 1 needle here. I'm not doing a 4 thread, so I haven't got 2 needles in here. So I've got my 1 needle. I'm going to drop this. I've just realised it's full of fluff because I've not cleaned it out. And I'm going to drop my blade. I don't want to be cutting this as I do it. And then on my machine, I've got an S and an R. I'm assuming that means serge and that means roll. I need to push this in, and then this slides to roll. And what it does, you've got this little bit here, and I don't know how well you can see that. Let's see if I can zoom in so you can see it a bit better. You've got this little bit here that moves out of the way, and that means that your finished stitch can get that little bit tighter. And then let's put that back up. And on the side, I've got a couple of dials, and this one is my stitch length. I'm going to make that smaller by turning it to R for rolled hem. And that is ready to go. So I'm going to do a little bit before I start, just to make sure it's all threaded properly. I need to make sure my tension is all correct. You need to do some test pieces to make sure it's all set up how it needs to be. And then it is so simple. I've not got any seams on here I'm going over. That's the only thing you need to think about, is when you're going over seams, just go a little bit slower, because what you don't want to do is when you get to a seam, just go off a little bit and end up with a bump. You want to keep it nice and straight. So what I normally do when I'm cutting my fabric out is I cut it a bit longer than the finished length initially, so that when I'm working on it, it doesn't fray. Let's move my camera angle a little bit while I'm sewing it, and let's zoom in. So what you don't want to end up is doing this and there's lots of fraying. So cut it longer than you need it, and then when you're ready to do your hem, you can trim it to the right length and it's going to be perfect. And try not to get my fingers in the way. I am just sewing down this, and it's just overlocking over that raw edge at exactly the right length. So I won't bore you watching the whole thing, and we can have a look at this once I've given it a little press. And that's now finished. You can see it's lovely and flat. It's a nice, neat finish. It's not going to fray, and this really is great for layering things up because it adds less bulk. I generally don't use this on a top layer. I tend to use it for linings, but you can use it on a top layer too. You can also, if you're using a really stretchy fabric, pull this out as you're sewing it, and then when it shrinks back, you'll get a nice little wiggly hem, which is a nice finish. I'll be really delighted if anyone comments on this video that they didn't know they could do this with their overlocker. I've got to admit, I had this overlocker for quite a while before I realised that I could do this kind of hem on it. I was only using it for finishing off seams, so I was delighted when I realised I could do this. Unfortunately, I don't have a garment with a curved hem with a facing, and so I will just show you here with the sample that I'm now going to demonstrate how to do, that this is the kind of hem. It's perfect for sewing a full skirt when you've got a curve on it. When you're sewing a curve like this, you can't just fold the hem up because you're going to be folding a big piece of fabric into a smaller space. You could do lots of little tucks, but actually putting a facing on like this is a much easier way to do it, and it gives you a much better finish. So I'll show you now how I made this sample for this curved hem with a facing. I've just cut this on a curve just to show an example of how I would do this. So I've cut my facing exactly the same shape as this, and I've cut it, I think it's about 5 centimetres, yeah, 5 centimetres deep. So you can do this as deep as you want to. You could do this really deep if you want to. You need to think about where you want your top stitching on the outside. Obviously, if you're hand sewing it, it doesn't matter so much. If you're top stitching it, just think about where you want that to sit. So I'm going to sew this on with the right sides together to start with. So I'm just going to pin that all the way around because I want my curve to be perfectly matched up. And I'm going to get this sewn on, and I've done a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So I'm just going to sew all the way around. You need to make sure you don't stretch either piece while you're doing it. So you don't need to see me sew it on. It's very straightforward. Just going to sew 1 centimetre from the edge all the way around. This is now sewn on, and this facing piece is basically going to sit on the inside there. And I want to make sure this all stays on the inside. So one thing I'm going to do, the same as you might have done a neckline before, is I'm going to do some understitching here. So I'm just going to put my seam allowance towards the hem of the dress, and I'm going to just sew this a couple of millimetres from the edge. Just sewing this with a regular stitch, nothing special. You just want to make sure that this is pulled over. You don't want anything getting caught up. You need to make sure your seam allowance is underneath the bit where you're sewing, and just stay the same distance from where you've just sewn this on and sew all the way around. Obviously, normally you would do it in a matching colour. You don't really want to be doing this in a contrast colour. I've got my understitching now on there, so it's going to help it stay on the inside, but what I don't want to do is keep all this seam allowance because it's going to be too bulky for this to sit nice and flat. So what I'm going to do is just trim it off. So if I lay this flat on the table and I pull this here, you can hold it up if you want, but I always find it's quite easy just to do it sitting flat on the table. And you just want to trim this so you've got a couple of millimetres spare. You've already sewn it a couple of millimetres from the actual seam where you did the understitching. So if you leave a couple of millimetres here, you're going to have nearly 1/2 centimetre total seam allowance, which is more than enough. So I'm just going to trim this off all the way around. This is now going to sit a lot better now it's trimmed. So I need to fold that to the inside, and I'm going to give it a good press before I do my finishing top stitch. So the outer fabric there, you want to make sure you can just about see that from the inside. Hopefully it shows up enough. And I'm going to press this from the inside all the way around with just the tiniest little bit showing, and that makes sure you don't see that facing from the outside. And now that that's pressed, you can see how neat that looks from the outside. So you can either hand sew this up, how I've shown before, or you can do some machine top stitch from the outside, which is what I'm going to do. Initially, I'm just going to put some pins going across this way just to make sure nothing moves. And then I am going to measure from the edge. You can do it using a seam guide on the machine if you want, but when it's something like this, I prefer to measure it all out before I start. And I'm going to sew this 3 centimetres up from the bottom. You can do whatever depth you want, just make sure your facing is deep enough that it catches it. So I'm just going to mark it out before I go so that when I come to stitch it, I know everything is sat in exactly the right place. So I'll get that sewn up now in my contrast thread so you can see what I've done. And that's it now finished with the top stitch. So you can do this stitching as close to the bottom or as high up as you want. Just make sure your facing is the right size to do it. If you're doing this kind of hem on a long full evening dress, you can use this plastic kind of tape. I can't think what the proper name for this is, but it's a woven plastic tape, which sounds awful. But actually, if you sew this into the hem, as you can imagine, when this is long and full on an evening dress or a wedding dress, something like that, it gives it a really good finish to keep this hem perfect. So comment below if you'd like to see me sew the same kind of hem with this plastic tape inside it for a more formal hem on an evening dress. And of course, I've saved the trickiest till last, jersey. If you've not worked with knits, jersey, interlock, any of those kind of fabrics before, I would say they're definitely the more tricky fabrics to work with. You need to make sure you don't stretch them when you're sewing them, but at the same time, you need a hem that's got stretch in it. You can't just sew a regular straight stitch because it won't give you that stretch. So this is a t-shirt I've made using a cover stitch machine, which gives you a perfect hem, exactly how you would see on a t-shirt that you've bought in a shop. So I'll show you how to use that, but I'm guessing most people don't have a cover stitch machine. So I'm also going to show you on a regular sewing machine how to sew a very, very similar hem using a twin needle that you can use with all sewing machines. I'll show you first on a regular sewing machine, and then I'll show you on the cover stitch machine how to do it. So this is the twin needle on the regular machine. So I've got quite a narrow twin needle. You can get them, I think, with them spaced a little bit further apart. And I wanted to show you this before I actually sew it with the overlocking. This gives a nice neat finish and looks a little bit more like a cover stitch when it's done. But you can't see what's going on underneath if I show you with this. So that's the twin needle. This is on the right side, how it'll look, and behind it just is this little kind of zigzag between both of the stitches. So let's show you how I have done it. So the first thing you need to do, I've overlocked it already, you need to decide how deep you want your hem and just pin this in place. So I'm going to fold this up 2 centimeters and I'm just going to put a few pins in to hold that in place. And then the tricky bit when you're sewing twin needle is you need to have that hem underneath so you can't see where you're sewing. So you really do need to get this spot on. So I'm just now replacing the pins that are underneath with pins on the right side because I obviously don't want to get those pins caught up in the sewing machine. And that's now ready to sew down here. I know that the edge of this is 2 centimeters from this edge. So I don't want to line this up with the 2 centimeter mark because it might slightly miss that. I'm going to come in a little bit. So I've got my twin needle in. You thread the machine up exactly the same, and then at the last minute you just put 1 thread through each needle. So as I said, I've folded this up 2 centimeters, but if I go to the 2 centimeter mark here, I could end up missing that. So I don't want to go as far as 1.5. I'm just going to go in between the 2. And you need to make sure that this is still in place when you start sewing. And let's see how we get on. Just pull those out of the way. This isn't something I do, I was going to say very often. I don't really do it at all because I've got a cover stitch machine. So hopefully I'm still doing a good job. And you just want to feed this fabric through. You don't want to stretch it as you're sewing it because it's going to look awful. But you also don't want it to start getting puckered up. So I'm standing very uncomfortably trying to see what I'm doing while sewing it with a tripod. So I'm going to stop it there and I'll show you how this looks when I'm finished. And that's how it looks once it's sewn up. So obviously normally you would use the same colour thread. So if it's a little bit wobbly, it doesn't matter. And that's how it looks on the inside. And this is why I wanted to show you the other sample first, if I just bring that back out. So that little row of stitching there, the little zigzag, is this bit of green that you can just about see here. And then obviously that's the overlocking. So that's how it looks, which is a pretty good hem for doing on a t-shirt if you don't have a cover stitch machine. This is my cover stitch machine. So this is what I use for doing jersey hems. I can't recommend this enough if you're going to be sewing a lot of jersey because it makes life a lot easier and it gives a much better and longer lasting finish. They're not the cheapest, but they are absolutely fantastic. So you've got the option of doing 1, 2 or 3 needles on this. I'm going to be doing another video very soon on how to sew jersey, so I'll go into a lot more detail. But I'm going to show you how to do the basic twin needle hem on this. So I've got 2 needles here, and you can either have them widely spaced like this or very close together. And I've put them on the wide setting, and then I'm using this to guide the width of my hem. So let's get a bit closer to where we're sewing. So I've prepared this exactly the same as the previous one, although I haven't overlocked it because this machine basically does everything in one go. So I've got that underneath, and I'm gonna just take that first pin out. And again, you've got to be careful, just like on the regular machine, that you don't let this pucker up or you don't pull it through as you're doing it and stretch it. You want to sew this nice and evenly. So I'm just going to feed this through very slowly. This is a great little gadget here for pushing the hem against. I'm just going to sew it up, and then I'll show you how this looks on both sides. Just like the other one, I would obviously normally sew this in the right colour thread. I wouldn't do a contrast. So I'm just gonna carry on sewing the whole length of this, and I always sew this slowly. You can see there, it has got caught a little bit, so I'm just gonna put the needles down and then lift the foot slightly and just pull that back. Sometimes it just gets a little bit stuck, but what you don't want to do, like you would with a woven fabric, is pull it as you go, because you're going to stretch it all out and it's going to look awful. And this is how it looks. It's got great stretch, which is perfect for t-shirts and things like that, and it is so neat on the inside as well. So you can play around with different stitch widths, you can do triple needle, there's all sorts you can do with the cover stitch machine. It's impossible to show every single type of hem in one tutorial, but I'm really hoping this video has shown you the 10 most common kinds of hems you're likely to use, and it's given you a bit of an idea of when to use each kind of hem. So please comment below if there's any other kinds of hems that you would like to see, and please like and share this video if it has been helpful, because every time you do, it helps me grow my channel and I can make even more tutorials. And finally, of course, please subscribe to my channel and check out my other tutorials. If you subscribe, you will see that I post new videos every single week showing you pattern cutting, sewing and making whole garments.